The first thing Park So-yoon registered was the smell. Not a metaphorical smell, not the soft conceptual impression of a different time arriving through narrative distance. An actual, physical assault on senses that had spent 28 years calibrated to filtered air, synthetic materials, and the clean chemical neutrality of modern urban life. Fermented soybean, wood ash, animal dung, raw grain, the iron salt smell of a butcher's work surface, smoke from a dozen fires that had been burning since before dawn. All of it arriving simultaneously, without warning, at full volume. He was on his back on a wooden floor. Above him, low rafters, darkened by years of cookfire smoke, hung with dried pepper bundles and tools he could not immediately identify. A paper window to his right let in gray morning light, the particular gray of an overcast Korean dawn, which he recognized not from memory of this era but from a kind of bone-level familiarity that no amount of temporal displacement had apparently removed. The floor beneath him was polished wood, cold, and he was lying on it without explanation or ceremony. His laptop was beside him. This was the fact that reorganized everything else. It was closed, black, completely inert, a rectangle of modern polymer and aluminium sitting on a Joseon-era wooden floor like an object that had been placed there by someone with a very specific sense of humor. So-yoon knew it was his own machine because he knew the small scratch on the upper left corner of the lid, made 3 years ago when he had knocked it against a subway turnstile. The scratch was present. The machine was present. The power indicator showed nothing. He sat up. 4 people were watching him from across the room. A man in his mid-40s with the forearms of someone who worked with metal, wide, scarred, carrying the particular density of a person whose physical strength was not gym-built but accumulated. He wore a hemp-work jacket over a darker undergarment and was holding a hammer with the loose, unconscious grip of someone who had been holding hammers since childhood. His expression said, "I have seen many things in my life and I am prepared to be unimpressed by this one." Behind him, a woman, perhaps 38, with a face that had the quality of sharpened steel. Not pretty in the decorative sense, but precise. Her eyes moved over So-yoon and then over the machine beside him with the same speed and the same quality of attention, cataloging both without visible emotion. She was the person running whatever this place was. He could tell from the way the other people in the room oriented to her without looking at her. A boy at the door, 13, perhaps, with ink-stained fingers and the bright, restless attention of someone who was supposed to be somewhere else and had decided this was more important. And behind him, half visible, an older man with the bearing of someone literate, watching with the particular wariness of a person who knew that unusual things tended to create paperwork. So-yoon looked at the machine. The machine looked back at him, dark and silent. He understood his situation in approximately 4 seconds of very fast thinking. He was in Joseon, Korea. The architecture, the clothing, the smell of the market outside, the quality of the light through the paper window, all of it converged on a single conclusion. He had no idea of the exact year. He had no idea of the city. He had no idea how he had arrived or whether the process was reversible. What he had was a modern laptop containing 3 terabytes of digitized historical archives, engineering references, medical texts, economic data, and a non-stable connection to 21st century information networks. And the laptop was dead. Without power, it was a piece of expensive modern sculpture. Without the laptop, he was simply a man in strange clothing sitting on someone's floor in a pre-industrial Korean city with no money, no credentials, no social position, and no plan. He needed to turn it on. He needed to do it now. Everything else was secondary. He stood up, and the 4 people across the room shifted, not retreating, adjusting, the way people adjust when something they were observing becomes active. So-yoon bowed. A proper bow, instinctive, the muscle memory of a lifetime of Korean social navigation firing across whatever temporal gap separated him from these people. The man with the hammer blinked. The woman's expression changed by approximately 2 degrees in the direction of reassessment. So-yoon pointed at the laptop. Then he made the gesture he had decided on in the 4 seconds of fast thinking. He pointed at it, shook his head, not working, then pointed at his own eyes, shook his head again, I am blind without it. Then he spread his hands and looked at the woman directly, because she was the decision-maker in this room and he had about 30 seconds before someone decided he was a problem rather than an opportunity. She said something to the man with the hammer. He didn't move. She said it again, with a different inflection, and this time he moved, setting the hammer down and taking a single step towards So-yun with the wary compliance of a large man doing something he hasn't decided to agree with yet. So-yun crouched beside the laptop and opened it. The dark screen. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He held it. Nothing. He turned it over and showed them the charging port, a small rectangular slot that meant nothing to anyone in this room, and then he pointed at the port, then at himself, then made the gesture of building something. Hands moving, assembling, constructing. The woman watched this sequence. Then she said one word to the boy at the door. The boy left at speed. Her name, he learned over the next 20 minutes through the slow, patient work of gesture and repetition, was Jang Bok-sun, and she ran the yard, a combined metalworking and goods storage property on the commercial edge of the market district. The man with the hammer was Cole, the smith, who had established through body language alone that his skepticism was professional rather than personal and would not shift until presented with evidence that met his specific standards. The older man with the literate bearing turned out to be Yu Sang-ho, a mid-level clerk of some kind who had been conducting business with Bok-sun when So-yun had apparently arrived. The boy came back with copper scraps. So-yun felt the specific relief of a person who has just confirmed that the first critical variable is available. He sorted the copper pieces immediately, which made Cole step forward with the proprietary instinct of a craftsman watching someone handle materials incorrectly, and So-yun held up one hand, wait, and kept sorting. Cole waited. This, So-yun noted, was significant. The man's willingness to pause rather than intervene meant Bok-sun had said something on his way to the copper pile. He needed 6 things in total. Copper, which he had. Iron, which was present in the workshop and abundant in varied forms. An acidic electrolyte, he pointed at the kitchen area visible through the interior doorway, mimed drinking, and made a sour face, held up the universal small amount gesture with his fingers. Bok-sun disappeared and came back with a ceramic jar of vinegar and a smaller container of brine from preserved vegetables. He pointed at both and nodded. She set them on the work surface without comment. Ceramic containers 5, roughly the same size. The boy Cogi, who had returned and stationed himself at So-yun's elbow with the focused attention of a person who had decided this was the most important thing happening in the city today, disappeared and came back with a collection of small pottery bowls that were clearly Bok-sun's household vessels and probably represented a social cost he would need to repay later. Wire, or the closest available equivalent. He pointed at the scrap metal pile, mimed thin and flexible, showed the diameter with his fingers. Cole produced copper wire without expression, not the fine-gauge wire of the modern era, heavier, irregular, but copper and functional. And zinc, which was the problem. He walked the workshop looking for it, checking the scrap pile, examining the metalwork in progress on the benches. Cole watched him work through the material with the attention of a person memorizing the selection criteria. So-yun found it in the form of brass fittings, not pure zinc, but a zinc-copper alloy that would work at reduced efficiency. He held up a fitting toward Cole. Cole nodded once, confirming he could have it. He built the pile on the main workbench. Alternating layers, copper disc, cloth soaked in vinegar brine mixture, brass plate. 5 cells, connected in series with copper wire twisted into connectors and pressed against the contact surfaces. The architecture of it was Volta's original design from 1800, simple, reproducible, producing approximately 1 volt per cell at inconsistent current. 5 cells, roughly 5 volts of unstable direct current. A modern laptop required 5 volts at regulated input to charge safely. The word regulated was doing significant work in that sentence. He stripped his charging cable with the small knife from his jacket pocket, exposed the internal power leads, identified the correct wires. Then he sat for a moment with the stripped end in one hand and the pile's output terminal in the other and thought about the specific probability that what he was about to do would destroy the only advantage he possessed in this century. Yu Sang-ho, who had been watching from the far wall with the expression of a man composing a report, said something quietly. Bok-sun, without looking at him, said something back that had the quality of, be quiet and watch. So-yun made the connection. Nothing happened for 3 seconds. Then the screen flickered. A single frame of backlight, the startup sequence beginning and immediately failing as the current fluctuated. Then it began again, held for 2 seconds, lost power, began again. The machine was finding and losing the voltage, its startup process stuttering across an inconsistent power source that was nothing like what it had been designed to accept. COGI made a sound, a single syllable, entirely involuntary. Cole took 2 full steps forward and stopped himself. So-yoon adjusted the connection pressure and the screen held. The battery indicator read 2% and was not climbing. The pile was providing just enough current to run the system but not enough to charge. He had minutes, not hours. The startup completed. His desktop appeared: wallpaper, folders, icons, the complete ordinary landscape of his digital life, rendered on a glowing rectangle in a Joseon-era workshop while 5 people stared at it with expressions that covered the full range from terror to hunger. He opened the archive folder and navigated fast. Geographic files. Korea. Administrative maps. He found it in 8 seconds, a detailed map of the southern provinces, Jeolla region, overlaid with city locations and population data compiled from multiple historical sources. He looked at the map. He looked at the paper window. He looked at the market sounds coming from outside, the particular rhythm of a large commercial district, the volume of it, the density. Jeonju. Jeolla Province. Population center, administrative seat, known for its market, its paper production, its ceramic tradition. Located in the southern interior, away from the coastal pressure points but connected to the major trade routes. Battery, 1%. He opened the next file. Korea, 1840s. Historical chronology. He scanned with the speed of a man reading for his life, which was precisely his situation. 1844, late Joseon. King Hyeonjong on the throne young, the court dominated by the An Kim clan. Corruption deepening at every administrative level. Famine conditions recurring across the southern provinces. Peasant unrest building toward the massive Imsil uprising of 1862, 18 years away, but its roots were already present in the tax extortion and land consolidation happening right now. Cholera. Recurring outbreaks through the 1840s and 1850s, moving along trade routes, killing thousands in cities exactly like this one. And one more item, with a specific date, 1846. 2 years from now. A French missionary execution that would trigger the first serious French naval response to Korean coastal waters. The beginning of the end of isolation. Battery, 0%. The screen went dark. The room was silent except for the market sounds outside and the breathing of 5 people who had just watched a dead black box produce life from a stack of bowls, wire, and sour liquid. So-yoon set the stripped cable down carefully. He looked at Bok-sun. She was looking at the dark screen with an expression that had moved past shock and arrived somewhere more dangerous: calculation. She was not afraid of what she had seen. She was thinking about what it meant, what it was worth, and what the correct response to its existence was. You, she said, and even with the centuries between them, even with every social and temporal barrier in place, the directness of her tone needed no translation, are going to explain what that is. He looked at the dead machine. At the workshop around him. At the 5 people who now knew something extraordinary existed and had no framework for understanding it. At the city of Jeonju going about its ordinary morning 2 years before the French warships and 18 years before the uprising and untold cholera deaths from now. He had 2% battery worth of information. He had a dead machine that needed a better power source than 5 bowls of vinegar. He had Bok-sun looking at him like a woman who had already decided he was useful and was now determining the terms. And he had the specific knowledge of a man who had just confirmed that he was sitting at the exact intersection of poverty, corruption, disease, and approaching catastrophe, with the only archive of what happened next stored in a machine that needed to stay alive long enough to matter. I will explain everything, he said. But first I need more copper. Status: end of day 1. Location confirmed: Jeonju, Jeolla Province, Joseon, Korea. Estimated year: 1844. Laptop charge: 0%. Requires improved power source. Archive accessed. Geographic data: regional chronology, critical event timeline. Known upcoming events: cholera outbreak, famine conditions, 1846 maritime crisis, 1862 uprising. Current assets: 1 dead laptop, 1 charging cable, 5 ceramic bowls. Jang Bok-sun's attention. Current liabilities: everything else. The machine needs power. Power requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires trust. Trust requires results. It always starts the same way. with someone asking you to explain yourself. And everything depending on what you say next. He explained himself with a demonstration. Not the machine was dead and would stay dead until he solved the power problem, which was a second-day problem. What he demonstrated on the evening of day one was something smaller and more immediately legible. He asked Baksun for her worst current problem, and she showed him the bellows. The forge bellows were failing. Not catastrophically, a slow failure, the kind that accumulated across months of use until the smith noticed his fire was running 10 degrees cooler than it should and the metal was taking longer to reach working temperature. Cole had been compensating by running the fire longer and burning more charcoal, which was expensive, and by working the bellows harder, which was tiring, and neither compensation had addressed the root problem, which was that the bellows chamber had developed a partial seal failure along the side seam where the leather had dried and cracked. So-yoon examined it for 3 minutes. Then he asked for tallow, the rendered animal fat that was present in any working household of this era, and beeswax, which Baksun produced from a storage shelf with the expression of someone donating a resource of actual value. He mixed them in a small ceramic dish over the forge's residual heat, working the ratio by instinct until the mixture had the consistency of a dense, pliable sealant. Then he worked it into the cracked seam with his fingers, forcing it into the gap with the pressure of someone who had spent a childhood helping his grandfather repair traditional equipment and had absorbed, without deciding to, the manual logic of making old things work again. He reseated the seam, bound it with a strip of cloth soaked in the same mixture, and let it cool for 20 minutes. Then he told Cole, through gesture, through pointing, through the specific mime of try it now, to test it. Cole worked the bellows with the careful attention of a man who expected disappointment. The airflow increased immediately. The fire responded, not a dramatic transformation, a professional one, the steady elevation of temperature that an experienced smith recognized as correct rather than merely hot. Cole worked it again, watching the coals. Then he set down the bellows handle and looked at So-yoon with an expression that had subtracted approximately 60% of its skepticism. He said nothing. But he moved 3 feet closer, which was its own language. The first real problem arrived the next morning, carried through Baksun's gate by a man named Park Sung-jin. He was a merchant, mid-40s, prosperous enough to be wearing layered silk, distressed enough to have the slightly unfocused quality of someone who had not slept. He was accompanied by a younger man, possibly a son or nephew, who was pale in the specific way of someone running a sustained fever. The boy, he was perhaps 17, was being supported at the elbow and moving with the careful economy of a person for whom each step was a negotiation with pain. Baksun received them in the yard. So-yoon watched from the workshop doorway. The merchant spoke at length. Baksun listened. Then she looked at So-yoon. He came forward. The boy had been ill for 6 days. The local physician had visited twice and prescribed herbal formulas that had produced no improvement. The wound on his forearm, visible when the younger man pushed back his sleeve at Baksun's instruction, was the source of it, a deep cut from a metalworking accident, wrapped in cloth that had not been changed in at least 3 days. The smell reached So-yoon from 2 feet away before he could see the wound clearly. When the cloth came off, the picture was complete: infection, significant, spreading up the forearm and the characteristic red tracking lines that meant the bacteria had entered the lymphatic system and were moving. In 1844, this was frequently a death sentence. The local physician's herbal formulas were not going to address septicemia. The boy would worsen for another 4 or 5 days and then the outcome would be determined by whether his immune system was strong enough to fight what the medicine was not equipped to fight. So-yoon looked at the wound for a long moment. He went to the laptop. The pile was still connected, 5% charge accumulated overnight from the slow, inconsistent current, which meant he had perhaps 12 minutes of screen time. He used 4 of them finding what he needed: field medicine references, wound infection management, pre-antibiotic era treatment methodology. The core of it was not complex. The wound needed to be cleaned, properly cleaned, not symbolically cleaned, but irrigated with something that would disrupt bacterial colonization. It needed to be exposed to air rather than wrapped in cloth that was holding moisture and warmth against the infection. And the boy needed clean water and food that his body could use to run the immune response that was currently his only real treatment option. None of this required anything that did not exist in Jeonju in 1844. He shut the laptop to preserve the remaining charge and went to work. He boiled water. Not warm water, a rolling boil, sustained, which he communicated to Boksun through the specific insistence of a person who understood that the difference between warm water and boiled water was the difference between cleaning a wound and contaminating it with a different population of bacteria. Boksun boiled the water without asking why, which confirmed his assessment of her as someone who prioritized results over explanation. He cleaned the wound thoroughly. The boy, whose name was Sungmin, held the expression of someone in significant pain, choosing not to show it, which Soyun respected and worked around efficiently. The irrigation took 10 minutes. He used boiled water and a small amount of the strongest grain alcohol Boksun could produce, which she found in a ceramic jar at the back of her storage room, and surrendered with the brief expression of someone making a real sacrifice. He dressed the wound open, a light covering that allowed airflow rather than the sealed wrapping that had been promoting the infection. He communicated through gesture and Seoji's instinctive translation work. The boy had developed an extraordinary ability to interpret Soyun's intent and render it in real language, that the dressing needed changing every morning with fresh boiled water, that the boy needed to drink as much clean boiled water as he could manage, and that the red tracking lines on the arm needed to be monitored and marked with charcoal at their current boundaries so any advancement could be identified immediately. The merchant watched all of this with the focused attention of a person whose wealth could not solve this particular problem and who had arrived at the uncomfortable position of hoping an unknown stranger could. He came back on the third morning. Soyun was in the workshop, working with Cole on a different problem, the forge itself, which had a structural inefficiency in its air channel that Soyun had identified the previous day and had been sketching improvement options for in charcoal on a flat board, when Boksun appeared at the doorway and said his name. Not the name he had given her, which was his real name and which she had difficulty with, the name she had assigned him, which was a single syllable that approximately meant the one who knows things. He came to the yard. Sungmin was standing without support. Not perfectly, he was still pale, still moving carefully, but standing, with the specific quality of someone whose body had made the turn from losing to recovering and was now engaged in the slower work of rebuilding. The red tracking lines on his arm had retreated. The wound, when the morning dressing came off, showed the beginning of clean tissue at its edges rather than the spreading margin of active infection. The merchant looked at Soyun and said something. Cogi, at his elbow, translated in the approximate vocabulary they had built together. He says you did what the doctor could not do. He asks what you want. Soyun looked at the merchant. Then at Boksun. Then at the workshop behind him. Cole visible through the doorway, the dead laptop on its shelf in the corner wrapped in cloth, the bellows working at proper capacity for the first time in months. He said two things. The first was a request for a specific quantity of copper, more than what was currently in the scrap pile, sheet copper if the merchant had access to it through his trade connections. And zinc. And more ceramic vessels. And any source of sulfuric acid, which he described as the liquid used in certain industrial processes, which produced an expression of cautious recognition on the merchant's face that suggested it was available somewhere in Jeonju's commercial district. The second thing he said was, "Tell no one where you got the treatment." The merchant looked at him. Soyun held his gaze and repeated it, through Cogi, with enough flatness that the instruction was clearly not negotiable. The merchant agreed, with the expression of a man filing this interaction in a mental category he did not yet have a label for. That evening, Boksun came to where Soyun was sitting with the laptop 8% charged now, the improved pile delivering better output, reviewing the cholera data he had pulled on the first day. She sat across from him and looked at the screen for a moment, not at the content but at the fact of it, the light it produced, the density of information visible in the text. Then she said something that Cogi, sitting nearby, rendered as, "You knew what to do before you looked at it." Soyun thought about this. It was accurate. The wound treatment had not required the laptop, he had known the methodology before he opened it. The laptop had been confirmation, not instruction. "Yes," he said. She looked at the screen again. Then at him. Then she said something longer, which Cogi translated with the careful seriousness of a boy who understood that what he was translating mattered. "Then the box is not where the knowledge is. The knowledge is in you. The box is something else." Soyun looked at her. She was right. And she had arrived at this conclusion on day 2, from watching him work for approximately 36 hours, which meant her analytical speed was something he needed to account for in every decision he made going forward. "The box shows me things I don't already know," he said. "Things that haven't happened yet. Things that are going to happen to this city. COGI translated. Baksun was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then you need more power for it." "Yes." "Then we build more power for it." She stood up. "Starting tomorrow. Cole will help. He doesn't like you yet, but he respects what you did to the bellows." She went back to the main house. Soyeon looked at the laptop screen. 8%. The cholera data sat open in front of him: outbreak patterns, transmission vectors, mortality rates in urban centers without clean water infrastructure. Jeonju's water supply came from wells that were adjacent to its waste disposal. The outbreak timeline in his archive suggested the next major wave would reach the southern provinces within 2 years. 2 years was enough time. Barely. He had a merchant who owed him a favor and access to materials. He had a smith who was beginning to respect results. He had a boy who could translate intent into language. He had a woman who had identified the correct problem power and committed to solving it before he had to ask. He had 8% battery and a city that did not know what was coming. It was not much. It was more than he had started with yesterday. Status: end of day 3 laptop charge 8%, improving copper and zinc supply, incoming via Park Sungjin sulfuric acid source, located wound infection, resolved. Sungmin recovering Cole, skepticism at 40%, declining Baksun, fully engaged, operational trust established. COGI, primary translator, learning fast. Yu Sangho, watching, not yet committed. Park Sungjin, indebted, resource access available. Cholera timeline, approximately 24 months. Power infrastructure, priority 1 identity. Questions from Market District, beginning. Someone saw the merchant leave. Someone noticed the boy recovered. In a city this size, 3 days is long enough for a story to start. The story has started. The improved power cell took 4 days to build properly. Park Sungjin delivered the copper on day 4, sheet copper, not scraps, cut into plates of consistent thickness with the clean edges of a material that had been prepared for trade rather than scavenged from a workshop floor. He delivered zinc plates the following morning, obtained through a contact in the metalworkers district whose precise identity he did not volunteer and Soyeon did not ask about. The sulfuric acid arrived in a sealed ceramic jar with the careful handling of something that had cost significantly more than its volume suggested. Soyeon built the new cell on a dedicated board in the corner of Cole's workshop, away from the forge heat, away from the water sources, away from the foot traffic of people coming and going through Baksun's yard. 12 cells this time instead of 5, alternating copper and zinc plates, each pair separated by cloth soaked in diluted sulfuric acid solution, connected in series with the copper wire that Cole had drawn to a finer gauge than the first attempt using a simple draw plate Soyeon had sketched and the smith had built in approximately 2 hours without being asked twice. The output was not elegant, but it was consistent, approximately 12 volts of direct current at a low amperage that was close enough to the laptop's charging requirements that the machine accepted it without immediately rejecting the input. The battery indicator climbed. Slowly, inconsistently, pausing for long minutes before advancing another percentage point, but climbing. Soyeon watched it reach 22% and then went to do something else, because watching a battery charge was not a productive use of time in any century. The forge improvement was Cole's idea, which was important. Soyeon had been thinking about the forge's structural inefficiency since the first day, a suboptimal air channel geometry that was losing heat through the sidewalls rather than concentrating it at the working surface. He had sketched 3 alternative designs in charcoal on the board he was using for technical drawings, and he had been considering how to introduce the concept to Cole without triggering the professional resistance of a craftsman being told his work was wrong by someone who had never held a hammer. He did not need to introduce it. On the morning of day 6, Cole came to the drawing board, looked at the sketches for a long time without speaking, and then tapped the third design, the one Soyeon had assessed as the most practical given available materials, with one blunt finger. Soyeon looked at him. Cole said something. COGI translated, he says the heat goes the wrong way. He's been thinking about it for 2 years. Tell him I've been thinking about it for 4 days, Soyeon said. And that he was right about what the problem was. COGI translated. Cole looked at Soyeon with the first expression that was not skepticism or neutral assessment, something that had more warmth in it, the specific warmth of a craftsman whose professional instinct has been confirmed by someone he is beginning to respect. They rebuilt the forge together over 3 days. Not from scratch, a targeted rebuild of the air channel and firebox geometry, using the existing structure as a foundation and modifying rather than replacing. Cole's hands knew the material in a way Soyun's did not, and Soyun's understanding of the thermodynamic principles involved gave the modification a direction that Cole's 2 years of frustrated intuition had been circling without finding. The combination worked in the way that combinations of different kinds of knowledge sometimes worked, faster and better than either would have managed alone. When they tested it on the morning of day 9, the forge reached working temperature in 40% less time than before and held it with 25% less charcoal input. Cole stood back from it and looked at Soyun with an expression that had completed its journey from skepticism to something that was not yet friendship but was in that direction. The division of labor arrived through necessity rather than theory. Bok Sun's yard employed, in the loose sense of that word in 1844 Jeonju, Cole as the primary smith, 2 younger men who handled rough preparation work and deliveries, Cogi as a general-purpose helper, and a woman named Yoon Harim who managed the accounts in her head because writing them down created tax exposure. Harim was perhaps 30, with the specific competence of someone who had been doing skilled work for years in a context that officially pretended she wasn't. Soyun noticed her on day 3. He did not approach her until day 7, because his read of the social architecture suggested that moving too fast would create problems in a direction he did not want. On day 7 he asked Bok Sun, through Cogi, whether Harim could be present when he was explaining production improvements to the 2 younger men. Bok Sun looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "She's been listening from the other room anyway." Harim came into the workshop. She stood at the edge of the group with the posture of someone prepared to be told to leave at any moment. Soyun addressed the explanation directly to her, which made the 2 younger men look at each other and look away again. Harim's attention was total, the focused, rapid absorption of a person who had been waiting for information to arrive in a form she was allowed to receive. The improvement he was explaining was simple: consistent measurement. The workshop currently produced metal fittings and tools that were good by the standards of individual craftsmanship, each piece made by eye and hand, each one slightly different from the last. This was normal. This was how everything was made in 1844. But it meant that pieces made for assembly did not reliably fit each other, that replacement parts required reworking, that quality varied with the attention and energy of the person making each piece on each given day. He had made a measuring template from a piece of flat iron, a gauge with specific notches at specific distances, calibrated against a standard he had established and marked on a board on the workshop wall. Every piece made against the gauge would be the same as every other piece made against the gauge. Not because the craftsman was more skilled but because the measurement removed the variation. This was not a new idea in 1844. Standardized measurement existed in various forms in various industries. It was new in this workshop, and its implications were not immediately obvious to people who had spent their working lives in a different paradigm. Harim understood it immediately. She picked up the gauge, looked at it, looked at the pieces currently in production, and said something to Bok Sun that Cogi translated as, "This means we can make twice as much with the same people." "Not twice," Soyun said. "Not yet. But in that direction." She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. Then she went to the account records in her head and said something longer, which Cogi rendered as, "If each fitting takes less time and they all fit correctly the first time, the 2 men can do rework in the afternoon." "What should they make in the afternoon?" Soyun looked at her. Then at Bok Sun. Bok Sun had the expression of a person who had known this conversation was coming and had been waiting to see how it went. "Agricultural tools," Soyun said. "Specific improvements. I'll sketch them tonight." Yu Sang-ho came to the workshop on day 11. He had been peripheral until then, present in Bok Sun's orbit, conducting his clerk's business, watching Soyun's activities with the careful attention of a literate man who was assembling a picture from fragments. When he arrived at the workshop doorway, it was with the deliberate posture of someone who had decided to stop observing and start participating. He had a proposal. He had contacts, not powerful ones, but functional ones, in Jeonju's commercial district. Merchants, traders, the mid-level network of people who moved goods between producers and buyers. He had observed that the workshop's output quality had improved significantly in the 10 days since Soyun's arrival. He had also observed that the market for quality metalwork in Jeonju was currently served by 3 established workshops, all of which produced inconsistent output at prices that reflected their monopoly position rather than their quality. If Bok Sun's workshop could produce consistently better output at competitive prices, and if that output could be introduced to buyers through his commercial contacts, the margin available was significant. So-Yun listened to this via COGI's translation and thought about it for approximately 15 seconds. What does he want in return, he asked. Yu Sang-ho smiled, slightly, at the directness of the question. He said, a share of the increased margin. And here he paused access to whatever So-Yun was willing to teach him about the methods behind the improvement. So-Yun looked at the man. Literate, commercially connected, demonstrably patient enough to watch for 11 days before approaching. A clerk by position but something more analytical by capacity. Can he write technical descriptions from verbal explanation? So-Yun asked. COGI put the question. Yu Sang-ho said he had been doing exactly that, from memory, every evening since day 3. So-Yun asked to see the notes. Yu Sang-ho produced them from his jacket, 8 pages of dense, careful script, a running account of what So-Yun had done and in what sequence, with marginal annotations that were clearly Yu Sang-ho's own analysis of the principles involved. The handwriting was precise. The analysis was not always correct, but it was always engaged, the notes of a person who was trying to understand the logic, not just record the events. So-Yun read through them slowly, because the classical Korean script required his full attention, and found, on page 6, a sentence that stopped him. Yu Sang-ho had written, "The stranger does not make new things. He makes old things correctly. The difference is in the method, not the material." So-Yun read it twice. Then he set the notes down and looked at Yu Sang-ho with a different quality of attention than he had given him before. Tell him yes, he said to COGI. He can have the share and the access. And I want him to be the one who writes down everything we do from this point forward. Everything. In enough detail that someone who had never seen the workshop could rebuild it from the notes. COGI translated. Yu Sang-ho absorbed this instruction and then asked one question, which COGI rendered as, why does it need to be written so that someone else could rebuild it? So-Yun looked at the laptop on its shelf, 18% battery having climbed over 4 days, the archive inside it full of things that needed to move from its storage into the world in a form that did not depend on a machine that could break, run out of power, or be taken. Because I might not always be here, he said. And the knowledge needs to survive without me. On day 14, the first competitor came to look. A man from one of the established metalwork workshops sent by his employer, probably, or curious on his own account, or both appeared at Boksun's gate in the early afternoon under the pretense of pricing a commission. He was shown the yard, the workshop, the output currently in production. He spent 20 minutes asking questions through the conventional social forms of a potential customer and another 10 minutes looking at things that a genuine customer would not have looked at. He left without commissioning anything. That evening, Boksun told So-Yun that the man's employer had a cousin in the local magistrate's office. So-Yun processed this information and then asked Harim, who had by this point become the workshop's functional operational manager through the straightforward mechanism of being the most competent person available for the role, to move the laptop storage location to a different part of the building. Not hidden, exactly. Simply not visible from the main workspace. Harim did this without asking why, which was becoming the characteristic response of everyone in So-Yun's small circle to instructions they had learned would turn out to be correct. The workshop's output that week was 30% higher than its previous average and 15% more consistent in dimensional accuracy. Yu Sang-ho had sold the first improved quality batch to 2 merchants in the commercial district at a margin that made Boksun look at the accounting with an expression that contained genuine surprise. Cole, finishing his work at the rebuilt forge at the end of day 14, said something to COGI without looking up from the piece he was cooling. COGI translated, he says he doesn't know where you came from. He says it doesn't matter. So-Yun looked at the workshop, at the improved forge, the measurement gauges on the wall, the organized work surfaces, the quality output stacked for delivery, the 5 people who were now operating with a logic that was different from what they had been doing 2 weeks ago. Not a factory. Not even close to a factory. A small traditional metalworking yard in a mid-sized Joseon city, run by a widow, staffed by a smith and 2 helpers and a boy and a clerk who was writing everything down. But it was producing more, better, faster, and with less waste than it had before. And it had a competitor's representative looking through its gate, and a magistrate's cousin being told about it, and a city that was 2 years from a cholera outbreak that would move through its water supply like a fire through dry paper. So-Yun had 19% battery and a production base and 4 people he trusted and approximately 22 months. The laptop needed more power. The city needed clean water. And somewhere in Jeonju's commercial and administrative district, someone had started asking questions about the stranger in Boksun's yard who knew too much. Both problems were coming on the same timeline. Status: end of day 14 laptop charge, 19% stable, slow climb workshop output, plus 30% volume, plus 15% dimensional consistency power cell, 12 cell configuration, stable active circle, Imcol, Boksun, COGI, Harim, Usangho, Park Sungjin Commercial Network, Usangho's contacts, 2 merchant buyers established competitor awareness, confirmed observation visit logged magistrate connection, identified, not yet active cholera timeline, 22 months clean water infrastructure, not started. The workshop is real now. Real things attract real attention. The question is which kind arrives first. On day 17, the laptop reached 31%. So-yoon spent 4 hours with it that evening, not on workshop logistics or production improvements, but on the archive. The full regional picture. Everything his 3 terabytes of digitized historical material could tell him about Jeonju, Jeolla Province, and the Korean Peninsula in the years immediately ahead. He read carefully, cross-referencing sources, building a timeline on paper, Usangho's paper, good quality, made in the Jeonju tradition that had been producing some of Korea's finest for centuries. He wrote in a compressed shorthand he had developed over years of academic work, a private notation system that would be unreadable to anyone who found the pages. What the archive told him was not a single disaster. It was a sequence. The cholera he already knew about, the next major wave moving through the southern provinces within 2 years, killing thousands in cities without clean water separation from waste. That was coming regardless of anything he did, unless he did something specific to prevent it in Jeonju specifically. But cholera was not the first item on the timeline. The first item was grain. The harvest records in his archive, compiled from multiple historical sources, cross-referenced against climate data and administrative records from the Joseon period, showed a pattern of regional crop failures across Jeolla Province in the mid-1840s. Not total famine, not the catastrophic scale of what Ireland was experiencing simultaneously on the other side of the world, but sustained shortfall, consecutive years of below-average yield driven by irregular rainfall and the systematic extraction of local grain reserves by a tax collection system that had become, under the current administration, essentially indistinguishable from organized predation. The peasant farming families in the districts surrounding Jeonju were already running on reduced margins. 2 more bad harvests would push significant numbers of them below the threshold of self-sufficiency. When that happened, they would come to the city, not violently, not yet, but as an economic pressure that would strain every resource Jeonju's market infrastructure was built to handle. And then the cholera would arrive into a city already stressed by food pressure and population influx from the surrounding districts. The combination was not in any single source. It was visible only from the outside, from the position of someone reading across multiple accounts with the knowledge of what each individual data point was part of. The local magistrate's office did not have this picture. The merchants did not have it. The physicians did not have it. So-yoon had it, written in compressed shorthand on 3 pages of Jeonju paper, and he sat with it for a long time before deciding what to do. The decision was not whether to act. That question had been settled on day 1, the moment he had read the cholera data and understood that he was not simply an observer of these events but a person physically present in the city where they would occur, with knowledge that could change their outcome. The question was how to act without becoming visible in the wrong way at the wrong time. He thought about this for 2 days, during which he continued the workshop's normal operations, continued the power cell's slow charge accumulation, and said nothing to anyone about what he had read. He needed to think clearly before he moved, because the moves available to him had different shapes and different costs, and choosing the wrong one early would close options he could not afford to lose. On day 19 he called a quiet meeting. Not a formal gathering, there was no tradition of formal gatherings in this context that he could invoke without creating alarm. Just the 6 people who had become his functional circle, assembled in Boksun's main room in the evening, which was a normal enough configuration that it did not attract comment from outside. He spoke through COGI, who had developed a translation capacity that was by now genuinely impressive, not just vocabulary but register, the ability to carry tone and urgency without distortion. He told them 3 things. The first was that the grain situation in the surrounding districts was going to worsen before it improved, and that Jeonju's market would feel the pressure of it within 1 year. He did not explain how he knew this. He said, I have studied the patterns. This is what patterns do. The second was that disease would follow the food pressure. He described what cholera did to a city, the water transmission, the speed of it, the mortality rate without intervention in enough clinical detail that the room was very quiet by the time he finished. The third was that both of these things could be significantly reduced in their impact on this specific city if specific actions were taken in the next 12 months. Bok-sun asked the question he had been expecting, "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I need help doing what needs to be done," he said. "And because you need to know what we're actually building toward. This is not about the workshop. The workshop is a foundation. What we're building toward is the city surviving what's coming." The room processed this. Yu Sang-ho, characteristically, asked the second most important question: what specifically do we do first? The water was first. It was always going to be first. Jeonju's water supply came from wells distributed through the residential and commercial districts, supplemented by water carried from the river on the city's eastern edge. The wells were good, deep, stone-lined, drawing from the groundwater table beneath the city. The problem was what was above the groundwater table: waste pits, animal enclosures, the accumulated organic matter of a densely populated urban settlement that had been managing its waste by proximity rather than separation for generations. The wells were not contaminated yet. In his archives account of the outbreak, the contamination began at the wells in the lower market district and spread to 3 others within the first 2 weeks of the epidemic's arrival. So-yeon needed to know exactly where each well was and what was within 50 feet of each one. He sent COGI to map them. The boy spent 3 days walking Jeonju with a charcoal stick and a folded piece of paper, marking well locations and noting adjacent structures. He returned with a map that was approximate but functional: 14 wells in the commercial and residential districts, 3 in the lower market area, 2 near the river access point. So-yeon overlaid this against the waste management patterns he had observed during his own walks through the city and identified 6 wells that were at significant risk. The immediate intervention was simple in principle and complicated in execution: relocate or seal the waste pits nearest to the high-risk wells and establish the practice of boiling drinking water as a standard rather than an exceptional measure. Simple in principle. Complicated in execution because the waste pits were on private property, the wells were communal infrastructure controlled by the district administration, and proposing changes to either required navigating a social and bureaucratic architecture that did not respond well to suggestions from a man who had been in the city for 3 weeks. This was where Park Sung-jin became useful in a different way. The merchant came to Bok-sun's yard on day 22 to deliver a second copper order and to check on his nephew's continued recovery, which was complete. Sungmin had been working for 10 days and the wound was fully healed. The gratitude was still present and active. So-yeon had been deliberate about not drawing on it prematurely, which meant it had accumulated rather than depleted. He drew on it now. He explained the water situation to Park Sung-jin in terms that a merchant could immediately calculate. If the lower market district's wells became contaminated during an epidemic, every commercial operation in that district would cease for the duration of the outbreak. The mortality among the district's working population would reduce available labor for months after recovery. The disruption to trade would be measurable and significant. Preventing contamination of those specific wells was not a charitable act, it was basic commercial risk management. Park Sung-jin listened to this with the focused attention of a man running numbers. Then he asked how much it would cost to relocate the problematic waste facilities near the 3 lowest market wells. So-yeon gave him the estimate he had prepared. Park Sung-jin was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had 2 business associates in the lower market district who owned property adjacent to 2 of the 3 high-risk wells. He thought they might be interested in this conversation, framed as So-yeon had framed it to him, not as public health intervention, but as property protection and commercial risk reduction. "One more thing," So-yeon said. "I need this done without my name on it." Park Sung-jin looked at him. "I know how strange that sounds," So-yeon said. "Do it anyway." The first signs of the grain pressure arrived on day 26, earlier than his timeline had projected. A group of farming families from a district 2 hours east of Jeonju appeared in the market with significantly less to sell than the same season the previous year, visible to anyone who tracked market volumes, which in practice meant Yu Sang-ho, who had been doing exactly that since So-yeon asked him to begin monitoring price and volume movements 2 weeks earlier. Yu Sang-ho brought So-yoon the numbers that evening with the expression of a man who had been keeping a separate set of calculations and had just watched them confirm an outcome he had been hoping would not occur. So-yoon looked at the figures. The shortfall was not catastrophic, not yet. But its trajectory was clear, and it was arriving 6 weeks ahead of his projected timeline, which meant the variables were moving faster than his archive's averages had suggested. He updated his written timeline. Then he told Boksun to begin purchasing and storing grain through Park Sung-jin's commercial network, not in quantities large enough to affect market prices, not in a single transaction that would attract attention, but steadily, distributed across multiple small purchases over the next 3 months. Boksun looked at the storage space she had available. Then at So-yoon. Then she said, "You knew this was coming before the farmers arrived?" "Yes." "How long before?" "Since day 17. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what cities did in the evening, settling, cooking, conducting its ordinary domestic operations without any awareness of the calculation being run in a widow's main room about how to keep it alive through what was coming. "You waited 9 days before telling us," she said. "Not as an accusation, as an observation being filed." "I needed to know what to do before I said what was coming," he said. "Telling people about a disaster without a plan just creates panic." She considered this. "Then, and now you have a plan. The beginning of one." She stood up, smoothing her jacket with the decisive movement of a person transitioning from receiving information to implementing it. "Then tell me what you need and in what order." On day 28, So-yoon walked through the lower market district in the early morning and looked at the 3 high-risk wells. 2 of them already had minor construction activity nearby. Park Sung-jin's associates had moved faster than expected. The waste facilities adjacent to the easternmost well were being relocated to a position that put them downhill and down current from the water table. It was not a permanent solution. It was a partial one, buying time and reducing risk while he worked on the more comprehensive infrastructure changes that were months away. He stood at the well and looked at the water surface 3 feet below the stone rim, clear, cold, carrying no sign yet of what his archive said was coming. A woman came to draw water while he was standing there. She looked at him briefly, the stranger who had been in the district for a month, whose name she probably knew in the way that everyone in a city this size eventually knew the names of the people who were slightly unusual. She drew her water and left. So-yoon watched her go. She did not know about the grain shortfall accelerating in the eastern districts. She did not know about the cholera moving along trade routes that would reach Jeonju's water supply within 20 months. She did not know that the man standing at the well was the only person in the city who had both pieces of information and was quietly moving construction workers and grain purchases and workshop improvements into positions that might change what happened to her and her household when both of those things arrived simultaneously. He was not a hero. He was not a government. He was one person with a partially charged laptop and a circle of 6 people and a plan that had more gaps in it than certainties. But the waste facility was being moved. The grain storage was beginning. The workshop was producing. Yu Sang-ho was writing everything down. It was the beginning of intervention. Not the heroic kind, the methodical kind, the kind that looked, from the outside, like a slightly unusual merchant's operation making sensible commercial decisions slightly ahead of market conditions. The kind that, if it worked, would never be visible as what it actually was. He turned from the well and walked back toward Boksun's yard. Behind him, the city continued its morning, unknowing and ordinary, moving toward a future that he was quietly trying to change before it arrived. Status: end of day 28. Laptop charge, 31% grain storage, initiated, 3-month accumulation plan. Active water infrastructure, 2 of 6 high-risk wells addressed. Park Sung-jin, fully engaged, commercial network active. Yu Sang-ho, market monitoring active, documentation current. Harem, workshop operations running independently. Cole, production at new standard. Training second worker. Grain shortfall timeline, revised, arriving 6 weeks ahead of projection. Cholera timeline, 20 months. Unchanged. Magistrate's interest, low but present. Identity questions in market district, increasing. The archive said the harvest would fail. The harvest is already failing. The archive was right. Which means the rest of it is also right. 20 months. He needs to move faster. The instructions were 1 page each. Yu Sang-ho produced them, 12 copies of each, written in the clear, accessible script of a man who had spent his professional life communicating administrative information to people who were not always patient with complexity. So-Yun dictated the content from the laptop's archive in the evenings, translating technical sanitation methodology into language that a household with no medical knowledge could follow without confusion. Yu Sang-ho wrote. COGI read each draft back aloud to test comprehension. When COGI stumbled, they rewrote the sentence. The result was 4 documents. The first covered water, boil drinking water, keep the boiling vessels separate from washing vessels, do not draw from the well nearest the lower waste pits until the relocation was complete. Simple, specific, actionable. The second covered food storage, keep grain elevated off dirt floors, seal ceramic storage vessels with a mixture So-Yun specified, check stored goods weekly for moisture intrusion. The mixture was a simple wax and tallow sealant that Cole's workshop was already producing as a secondary product and that Harim had begun selling through Yu Sang-ho's commercial contacts at a margin that covered its production cost 3 times over. The third covered waste, distance requirements between waste disposal and water sources, the practice of covering waste with ash or earth to reduce insect contact, the importance of keeping animal enclosures on the downhill side of any water source. The fourth was the shortest and, So-Yun suspected, the most important: what to do when someone in the household showed symptoms of severe gastrointestinal illness. Not medical treatment, he had no antibiotics, no rehydration salts in pharmaceutical form, nothing that required the 21st century. What he had was the knowledge that cholera killed primarily through dehydration, that keeping a sick person hydrated with clean boiled water dramatically improved survival odds, and that isolating their waste from the household water supply was the single most effective intervention available without modern medicine. He had Yu Sang-ho write that one 3 times until it was short enough to memorize in 5 minutes. Distribution was Harim's operation. She had been running Boksun's Yard's accounts in her head for 3 years and had developed, in that time, a detailed mental map of the commercial district's social architecture, who dealt with whom, which households were connected through trade relationships, which merchants had networks that extended into the residential districts beyond the market center. So-Yun gave her the 12 copies and a simple instruction: find 12 households that were central enough in the district's social network that information given to them would move outward on its own. She came back 2 days later with a list of 23 names. I said 12, So-Yun said. 12 was wrong, she said. The network doesn't work in 12s. These 23 cover the correct nodes. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He said, how many more copies do you need? 40, she said. 30 for the households. 10 for the market stall operators in the lower district who deal with the farming families when they come to sell. Yu Sang-ho produced 40 copies over 3 days without complaint, though his hand was visibly tired by the end of it. COGI delivered them in batches, framed as practical household guidance from a respected source, the source being, in each case, whatever person in the recipient's social network was most likely to be trusted. Not So-Yun's name. Never So-Yun's name. The knowledge had to move on its own credibility, not on his. The storage system was harder. Grain that was purchased and stored incorrectly was grain that rotted, which was worse than grain not purchased at all because it created the false impression of security while the actual supply was degrading. So-Yun had been watching Boksun's storage space with increasing concern. The existing facilities were adequate for a normal commercial operation but not for the 3-month accumulation he had requested. He needed more storage. He needed it to be dry, ventilated, and not obviously associated with Boksun's Yard, because a large visible grain reserve was an invitation for exactly the kind of official attention he was trying to avoid. Park Sung-jin solved this in the way that merchants solved logistical problems, through the distributed network of commercial relationships he had been building for 20 years. 3 separate storage locations, none of them large enough individually to attract comment, all of them connected through his trade network and accessible on short notice. The grain moved through his normal commercial channels, purchased in the normal way goods were purchased, stored in facilities that handled many commodities and where additional stock was unremarkable. So-Yun worked out the rotation schedule, how long each batch could store before quality degraded, how to cycle through the reserve to keep the stock fresh, how to move supply to market without creating visible price effects. He gave the schedule to Harim in written form. She read it once, asked 2 clarifying questions, and did not ask again. By day 40, the reserve represented approximately 6 weeks of food security for 200 households at reduced consumption. Not enough. Nowhere near enough for a city of Jeonju's size facing a sustained regional shortfall. But it was 6 weeks more than nothing, and it was growing at a rate that Harim's tracking said would reach 10 weeks within 2 months. The boiling practice spread faster than he had expected. He had anticipated resistance, the friction of established habit, the social cost of appearing to criticize practices that had been normal for generations, the practical objection that fuel for sustained boiling was not free. What he had not fully accounted for was the existing social network among the women who managed most of Jeonju's household water and food operations. They talked to each other. They compared notes. They were already aware, in the practical experiential way of people who managed domestic logistics daily, that certain wells at certain times of year produced illness and others did not. The written instructions gave language and specificity to something that had existed as vague folk knowledge. They spread through the household network faster than Yu Sangho's careful hand could produce copies. By day 45, COGI was reporting that he had seen handwritten versions of the water document copied by recipients onto their own paper in households where no copy had been formally delivered. The knowledge was replicating itself. So-yeon noted this with the specific satisfaction of a person watching his system work correctly, and then immediately identified the problem it created. Information spreading that fast through a city's social network eventually reached people who would ask where it came from. On day 47, it reached the assistant to the district magistrate. His name was Choi Byung-wook, and he arrived at Boksun's gate on a Tuesday morning with the bearing of a minor official exercising authority he wanted to be perceived as larger than it was. He was perhaps 30, with the specific combination of literacy and bureaucratic position that produced, in the Joseon administrative system, a person who was neither powerful enough to be dangerous independently nor obscure enough to ignore. He asked, through the conventional forms of administrative inquiry, about the source of the sanitation documents circulating in the lower market district. Boksun received him in the yard. So-yoon was visible in the workshop doorway but did not come forward. Boksun told him, with the practiced composure of a woman who had been managing official inquiries about her business operations for 3 years since her husband's death, that the documents were practical household guidance prepared by a learned man she employed, based on medical knowledge from classical texts. She mentioned 2 specific classical Korean medical references by title names So-yoon had given her for exactly this eventuality, drawn from his archives records of texts that existed and were respected in the Joseon scholarly tradition. Choi Byung-wook wrote something in his ledger. Then he asked about the grain purchases. Boksun said that Park Sung-jin's commercial operation was responsible for those, and that questions about his business practices were properly directed to him. She provided this information with the smooth efficiency of someone who had established exactly this conversational path in advance. Choi Byung-wook wrote something else. Then he looked at the workshop doorway where So-yoon was standing and asked who the foreign-looking man was. Boksun said he was a scholar from the northern provinces, of Korean family, who had come to Jeonju for commercial reasons and whose contributions to her household operation had been practically valuable. Choi Byung-wook looked at So-yoon. So-yoon did not move. He held the official's gaze with the specific quality of stillness that communicated neither challenge nor submission, the posture of a person who had nothing to hide and was not going to perform transparency he didn't know. The official left after 20 minutes. That evening, Park Sung-jin came to the yard with news that did not require the framing of good news or bad news because it was clearly both simultaneously. 3 merchants in the commercial district had independently begun boiling their household water and had separately, without coordination, simply as a result of normal social conversation, begun recommending the practice to their neighbors. One of them had told his neighbor that the practice came from a foreign scholar who had some kind of medical knowledge. The neighbor had told 2 others. So-yoon's name was now in the market district's circulation as a person associated with practical useful knowledge, rather than simply as a stranger in Boksun's yard. This was the face slap arriving from the other direction, not the contempt of people who thought he was useless, but the attention of people who had concluded he was useful and wanted access to whatever he knew. The physician guilds are unhappy, Park Sung-jin added. So-yoon had expected this. The traditional physicians in Jeonju operated within a professional and commercial framework that gave them sole legitimate authority over medical knowledge in the city. A document circulating through the household network that told people how to prevent disease, without their involvement, without their approval, without their fees, was a direct challenge to that framework, regardless of whether it had saved any lives yet. How unhappy? So-yoon asked. Park Sung-jin said, unhappy enough to have spoken to someone they knew in the magistrate's office. Which connected to Choi Byung-wook. Which connected to whoever Choi Byung-wook reported to. The lines were drawing themselves without any action on So-yoon's part, the natural consequence of becoming visible in a city where visibility was regulated by existing interests. He had known it was coming. Knowing did not make it comfortable. On day 50, Haram produced the first complete inventory of the reserve and operational stocks, a dense, precise document that covered the grain storage, the workshop's raw material supply, the power cell's consumables, the medical supply cache So-yoon had been quietly building from materials available through the apothecary district. She had developed her own notation system for it, adapted from the account-keeping format she had used for years and refined toward the greater precision that So-yoon's approach to documentation demanded. He read through it and found one error in the grain rotation dates. He showed it to her. She looked at it, identified the source of the discrepancy in 30 seconds, and corrected it without expression. You've been doing this in your head for 3 years, he said. Longer, she said. Why hasn't anyone given you a formal position doing it? She looked at him with the patient expression of a person explaining something to someone who was, in this particular dimension, less intelligent than they thought they were. He understood immediately. 19 months until the cholera. 18 months until the grain pressure became critical. And in the administrative and social structure of 1844 Jeonju, the most operationally competent person in his circle occupied a position that was invisible by design. He filed this problem alongside the physician guilds in Choi Byung-wook and the magistrate's office and the 6 wells still unaddressed and the grain reserve still 10 weeks short of adequate, in the growing list of things that needed to be solved in an order he had not yet fully determined. The laptop was at 38%. The archive was available. The timeline was clear. What was becoming less clear, with every week that passed and every intervention that spread beyond the boundaries of Baksun's yard, was how much longer he could remain the answer to Jeonju's problems without becoming, to someone with authority, the source of a problem that needed to be removed. He was useful. Dangerously, visibly, undeniably useful. In 1844 Joseon, that was not always a safe thing to be. Status end of day 50 laptop charge, 38% grain reserve, 6 weeks capacity, growing toward 10 water documents, circulating independently, replication confirmed boiling practice adoption, estimated 40% of lower market district households high-risk wells addressed, 4 of 6 storage network, 3 locations, operational harem, inventory system active, full operational management physician guild, hostile magistrate contact confirmed Choi Byung-wook, active inquiry, identity questions filed cholera. Timeline, 19 months grain crisis timeline, 14 months to critical threshold. The documents are in 40 households he didn't visit. The boiling practice is in households that copied it by hand. The knowledge is moving without him. That was the goal. The problem is that everything moving has his shape on it. And the magistrate's office is learning to read that shape. Part 6, when the map starts lying, the magistrate's name was Han Song-moo, and he did not come himself. He sent a man named Kwak, no title offered, no role specified, which in the administrative language of Joseon officialdom communicated more than a formal introduction would have. Kwak was perhaps 50, with the weathered composure of someone who had spent decades in the space between official authority and its practical application. He arrived at Baksun's gate on a morning in the 63rd day with 2 younger men behind him and the unhurried manner of a person who was confident the conversation would proceed on his terms regardless of how it began. Baksun received him. So-yoon came to the yard when she sent Cogi to the workshop with the particular errand that meant, come now, bring nothing, say less than you think you should. Kwak looked at So-yoon for a long moment before speaking. Then he said, through the formal registers of official inquiry, that the magistrate Han Song-moo had taken note of certain activities in the lower market district, the circulation of written documents, the modification of waste facilities on private property, the accumulation of grain stocks through commercial channels, and wished to understand their origin and purpose. So-yoon answered through Cogi, carefully, in the register of a man with nothing to conceal and no particular interest in concealing it. He described himself as a scholar with practical training in classical medicine and engineering, currently assisting a household operation with efficiency improvements. The documents were based on established medical texts. The waste facility modifications had been undertaken by property owners on their own initiative, for their own practical reasons. The grain purchases were commercial transactions within Park Sung-jin's normal trading operations. Every sentence was accurate. None of them were complete. Guak listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to hear the shape of what was not being said. He asked one more question: where had So-yoon received his training? So-yoon named a city in the northern provinces. Far enough away that verification was slow. Close enough to be plausible. Guak wrote something on a folded paper. Then he said that the magistrate Han Song-mu would be pleased to receive the scholar in formal audience at his convenience, to discuss matters of mutual interest. He delivered this invitation in the tone of an invitation that was not optional. After Guak left, Bok-sun looked at So-yoon with an expression that communicated, without words, that the period of operating quietly at the edge of official attention was over. He opened the laptop that evening with 41% battery and looked for Han Song-mu. The magistrate was in his archive, a minor entry in the administrative records of Jeolla province, a name and a list of district officials with dates of appointment and removal. The dates placed him in Jeonju from 1842 to 1849. His removal was noted as disciplinary, connected to financial irregularities during the grain crisis years. So-yoon read this 3 times. Then he checked the grain crisis dates. The archive said peak shortage conditions in the Jeonju district would occur in a window beginning approximately 13 months from now. He had read this on day 17 and built his storage plan around it. The date was different. Not dramatically different, 2 months earlier than the figure he had recorded on day 17. He went back to his written notes and confirmed the discrepancy. The archive's date had shifted. The same source file, the same document, a different figure. He sat with this for a long moment. He opened his second source, a different digitized historical text covering the same period. The date there was different again, splitting the difference between his original reading and the current one, suggesting that neither figure was stable. He checked a third source. The third source no longer contained the passage he had previously read. The section was present, the surrounding text was intact, but the specific paragraph covering the Jeonju district grain shortfall timeline had changed, not disappeared, changed. The content was different from what he had recorded. His written notes said one thing. The archive now said another. He closed the laptop carefully and sat in the dark workshop for 20 minutes, thinking about what this meant with the precise attention of someone who needed to understand a problem completely before reacting to it. The archive was not fixed. It was a record of a future that he was in the process of changing, and as the changes propagated, as the waste facilities were moved, as the water practices spread, as the grain reserve accumulated, as Sungmin survived and Park Sungjin's commercial network redirected, the history that those changes were embedded and shifted around them. The dates moved because the events were moving. The sources contradicted each other because he was creating a timeline that no single historical account had ever described, because no single historical account had ever needed to describe it. His map of the future was becoming a map of a future that no longer existed in the form he had read it. The meeting with Han Song-mu happened on day 68. The magistrate received him in a formal room that communicated, through its furnishings and arrangement, a precise quantity of official weight enough to establish authority, not so much as to suggest anxiety about it. Han Song-mu was perhaps 55, with the layered composure of a man who had spent decades managing the gap between what was officially true and what was practically true in a provincial administrative role. He was not stupid. He was not corrupt in the crude sense. He was a person who had survived in his position by understanding how power moved and positioning himself along its currents. He offered tea. So-yoon accepted. The conversation moved through 3 phases. The first phase was the official one. Han Song-mu expressed the magistrate's office's general interest in the welfare of the district's commercial operations and the health of its population, and noted that certain recent activities had come to his attention as potentially beneficial developments that the administration would wish to support and properly oversee. Support and properly oversee was doing significant work in that sentence. The second phase, which began when Han Song-mu set down his teacup and looked at So-yoon with a different quality of attention, was the real one. He said that he had made inquiries to the northern provinces about a scholar of So-yoon's description and credentials. He said that the inquiries had not yet returned a clear answer. He said that in his experience, men whose credentials resisted verification were either frauds or something considerably more interesting, and that the evidence of the past 2 months suggested So-yoon was the latter. So-yoon said nothing. Han Song-mu said, the grain situation in the eastern districts was worsening. His own administrative sources, the tax collection reports, the market volume figures, confirmed a shortfall that was developing ahead of seasonal expectations. He had been attempting to secure additional grain supplies through official channels for 6 weeks and had encountered the standard delays of an administrative system that moved at the speed of correspondence between provincial capitals. He looked at So-yoon. So-yoon understood what was being communicated. Not a threat. An offer. Han Song-moo had a problem and had identified a person who appeared to know more about the problem's shape than the official apparatus did. He was proposing alignment. The third phase of the conversation was So-yoon's answer. He said, the grain situation would reach its critical point earlier than current official projections suggested. He did not say how he knew this. He said that the most effective immediate intervention was distributed storage, not a single official reserve that created both a political target and a single point of failure, but a network of smaller stocks held through commercial channels that could be released to market at controlled rates when the shortfall peaked. Han Song-moo listened to this with the expression of a man hearing a solution described by someone who had already implemented part of it. He asked if So-yoon would be willing to consult on the administration's response planning. So-yoon said he would be willing to share relevant knowledge with any effort that genuinely served the district's population. He said this with enough precise qualification that the offer of consultation was not the same as the offer of subordination. Han Song-moo heard the distinction. He smiled slightly, the smile of a man who appreciated precision even when it was deployed against his interests. The meeting ended without a formal agreement, which was itself a kind of agreement. He told Bok-sun that evening, and watched her process it. She was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said, "He will try to own what you know. That is what officials do with useful things." "I know." "Then why did you go?" "Because not going was worse. He already knows the outline. If I refuse the conversation, he fills the outline with his own interpretation. I'd rather he have the accurate version, the version where I'm a useful scholar with practical knowledge, than the version where I'm a threat to be removed." She thought about this. Then, and if he decides the useful scholar is more valuable as a controlled asset than a free one? So-yoon looked at the laptop on its shelf. 41%. The archive shifting beneath him like ground that had seemed solid and was revealing itself to be something more complicated. He had checked the cholera timeline that morning, it had moved by 3 weeks from his original reading. Not far. But in the same direction as the grain date. Both threats arriving slightly earlier than his original archive had shown, which meant his interventions were having an effect on the timeline but were also compressing it. The future was accelerating toward him as he pushed against it. "Then we need to be too embedded to remove cleanly," he said. "The grain network, the water practices, the workshop output, all of it needs to be distributed through enough people and enough structures that taking me out of the picture doesn't end it. It just continues without me." "You've been building toward that already," she said. "Not fast enough." On day 70, he opened the laptop and went to the section of his archive covering the 1846 French naval incident, the event that he had identified on day 1 as a fixed point on the regional timeline, distant enough to seem theoretical but close enough to matter. The entry was shorter than he remembered. He checked his notes. On day 1, he had read 2 paragraphs, the missionary execution, the French response, the diplomatic consequences. The archive now contained 1 paragraph. The second paragraph, the one detailing the specific diplomatic chain of events, was gone. Not changed. Gone. He checked a secondary source. The secondary source described the same events but with different dates, shifted by 4 months from the original. A third source mentioned a related event that his original reading had not mentioned at all, suggesting a development that had not been in his archive 70 days ago. The timeline he had arrived with was dissolving at the edges. The core events were still present: cholera, grain crisis, the broader political pressures building toward the 1862 uprising. But the precise shape of them, the specific dates and sequences and actors that had given him his operational advantage, was becoming less reliable with every intervention he made. He had come to 1844 with a map. The map was becoming a sketch. The sketch was becoming an approximation. The approximation was becoming a general direction. He closed the laptop. Across the city, 40 households were boiling their water. The grain reserve held 6 weeks of supply for 200 families. Im Cole's workshop was producing at a standard that was visibly different from its competitors. Yu Sang-ho was writing everything down. Haram was tracking every resource. COGI could translate not just words but intent. Han Song-mu was deciding what kind of asset Soyun was. And the archive that had made all of it possible was quietly, incrementally, accurately reflecting the fact that the future Soyun had read was no longer the future he was living in. He had been changing history for 70 days. History was changing back. Status end of day 70 laptop charge, 41% archive status, degrading, dates shifting, entries disappearing, sources contradicting grain crisis timeline, revised 2 months earlier than original projection cholera timeline, 3 weeks earlier than original projection now 17 months Han Song-mu, active interest, consultation requested, intent unclear guac. Ongoing inquiry into Soyun's background physician guilds, formal complaint filed with magistrate's office network status, grain, water. Workshop operational and partially self-sustaining. The archive had 100% of the future on day 1. It has approximately 71% now. The missing 29% is the future he already changed. The question is what happens when it reaches 0. The question is what he does when the map runs out. The answer is the same thing people have always done. He will have to build the road while walking it. The teaching began with COGI, because COGI was already learning whether Soyun taught him formally or not. The boy had been absorbing everything for 70 days, the translation work, the technical conversations, the production discussions, the medical references, the sanitation documents, the inventory systems. He had the specific quality of intelligence that was not simply fast but structural. He did not just remember what Soyun said, he remembered why Soyun said it, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a person who could repeat knowledge and a person who could apply it. On day 72, Soyun gave him the first formal lesson. Not a lesson in any particular technical subject. A lesson in method, how to look at a problem and identify what kind of problem it was before deciding how to approach it. The distinction between a resource problem, which required acquisition, and an organization problem, which required restructuring, and a knowledge problem, which required information. Most of the difficulties Soyun had encountered in Jeonju were combinations of all three, and the error that most people made in 1844 and, he reflected, in every other era, was treating organization problems as resource problems and throwing more material at a situation that needed a different arrangement of what was already present. COGI listened with the focused stillness of someone committing a framework to memory rather than a fact. Then he asked, "What kind of problem is the water?" Soyun looked at him. "Tell me what you think." COGI said, "The water itself is not the problem. The water is the same water it has always been. The problem is that people do not understand what makes it dangerous and what makes it safe. So it is a knowledge problem. But people also cannot easily boil water if they do not have fuel, so it is also a resource problem. And people do not coordinate their waste practices with their water sources, so it is also an organization problem." "All three," Soyun said. "All three," COGI confirmed. "So you have to solve all three, but not in the same way or at the same time." Soyun looked at the boy for a moment.